What happens when we think about something that does not exist? Brentano's psychology had established that every mental act is directed toward an object. But the mature Brentano insisted that those objects had to be real, individual substances. His student Alexius Meinong refused to accept that restriction. If we can think about centaurs, mountains of gold, or the round square, and if those thoughts are genuine mental acts, then psychology must acknowledge objects that do not exist, that cannot even possibly exist. This lesson examines Meinong's theory of objects, his radical expansion of the domain of intentionality, his principle of the independence of so-being from being, and his influence on Gestalt psychology and on subsequent philosophy. The problem Meinong raises is born directly from Brentano's psychology, but it carries that psychology into territory Brentano would never have accepted. Intentionality, as Brentano defined it, demands that every mental act be directed toward an object. There is no thought without something thought, no desire without something desired. So far, Meinong agrees. But then the question arises, what happens when we think about something that does not exist? I think of a centaur. My thought is real, it is a mental act that occurs in time, that I can describe, that has consequences. If descriptive psychology is to account for all psychical phenomena, it must account for this one too. Yet if the centaur does not exist, what is my thought directed toward? If we say it is directed at nothing, then we are saying there is a mental act without an object, which contradicts the very definition of intentionality. If we say it is directed at something, then we must admit there are objects that do not exist. The problem has both an intentional and a psychological dimension. The intentional dimension is strictly logical. How can an act point to something that is not there? The psychological dimension is methodological. Can psychology study acts directed at centaurs, numbers, moral values, the round square? For Meinong, the answer is clear. Psychology cannot afford to ignore any of these acts. All of them are real psychical phenomena, and if intentionality demands objects for them, then we must accept that those objects, in some way, are. Meinong's work is concentrated in a relatively brief period, between 1899 and 1904, but its philosophical density is extraordinary. 3 fundamental texts mark his output. In 1899 he published On Objects of Higher Order. There he introduces a notion that would have decisive consequences for psychology. There are objects that do not exist by themselves but are founded on other objects. A melody, for example, is not an independent thing. It is founded on the notes that compose it, yet it is something more than the sum of those notes. This idea, applied to perception, would become the foundation of Gestalt psychology. His student Ehrenfels would take from here the concept of Gestalt quality. In 1902 On Assumptions appeared, a work that expands the Brentanian classification of psychical acts. Brentano had distinguished 3 classes: presentations, judgments, and emotions. Meinong adds a 4th: assumptions or suppositions. When we read a novel or entertain a hypothesis, we do not judge that what is narrated is true, but neither do we merely present it. We assume its content, we take it as if it were the case. This analysis enriches descriptive psychology with a new type of act. In 1904 he published On the Theory of Objects, the most systematic exposition of his thought. There he formulates the principle that defines his entire philosophy. The so-being of an object, its properties, what it is independent of its being, whether it exists or not. The centaur has a horse's head and a human torso, though it does not exist. The round square is round and square at once, though it is impossible. The task of the theory of objects is to study everything that can be thought, whether it exists or not. As for indirect sources, the reception of Meinong in the English-speaking world is largely due to John Findlay, whose book Meinong's Theory of Objects of 1933 remains a classic reference. Alongside this, the Graz school, with disciples such as Ernst Mally and Rudolf Amüsator, continued to develop aspects of the theory of objects after Meinong's death, consolidating a research center that kept his legacy alive for decades. Alexius Meinong pursued his career in Graz, an Austrian city where he founded the first laboratory of experimental psychology in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1894. There he built his own school, the Graz School, which for decades rivaled and influenced the Vienna School, where Brentano and his closest disciples continued to work. Meinong had studied under Brentano in Vienna between 1875 and 1878, the very years in which Husserl, Stumpf, and Twardowski were attending the master's lectures. Of these, Twardowski was the first to take the decisive step. In 1894 he published a short but influential treatise on the distinction between the content and the object of a presentation. The content is what is in the mind, the act of presenting and its internal matter. The object is that toward which the act is directed, what lies outside the mind. This distinction, which Brentano had never clearly drawn, is Meinong's immediate starting point. On that foundation, Meinong consummates the break with Brentano. For the mature Brentano, only individual substances exist. Intentional objects are transcendent and real. Meinong replies, what about the centaur? What about the number 3? What about moral duty? They are not substances, they do not exist in space and time, yet we think about them constantly. If psychology is to account for all mental acts, it must accept that these objects, in some way, are. Act psychology is thus transformed into a theory of objects, a discipline broader than traditional ontology, one that studies everything that can be thought, whether it exists or not. Meinong's theoretical proposal is one of the boldest in the entire Brentanian tradition. It consists in founding a new discipline, the Gegenstandstheorie or theory of objects, whose domain is absolutely universal. Everything that can be thought, without exception. This discipline is prior both to metaphysics and to psychology. Metaphysics asks what exists. Psychology asks how we come to know what exists. But before answering those questions, Meinong says, we must establish the complete domain of the thinkable. For we think about many things that do not exist, and if metaphysics concerns itself only with what exists, it leaves out the greater part of our mental life. The theory of objects comes to fill that gap. Objects are classified into several types. First, existent objects. Real things that occupy a place in space and time. This table, that tree. These are the only objects Brentano recognized. Second, subsistent objects. Entities that do not exist in space and time yet have properties. Numbers, geometric figures, relations. The number 3 is nowhere, yet it is odd, prime, greater than 2. Third, ideal objects. Values, duties, ends. They are not things, but they are what our emotional and volitional acts are directed toward. Fourth, and here lies the greatest audacity, impossible objects. The round square, contradiction-made object. These two are thinkable. These two have properties. The round square is round and square at once. All this rests on the principle of the independence of so being from being. The properties of an object, what the object is, do not depend on the object's existing. We can describe a centaur in full detail without having the slightest idea whether it exists. Mathematics studies the properties of numbers without asking whether numbers exist. Ethics studies values without asking whether values are real things. Meinong condenses this into a formula as elegant as it is provocative. There are objects of which it is true that there are no such objects. The theory of objects is not gratuitous speculation. Meinong supports it with 3 arguments that appeal to psychology, to language, and to scientific practice. The first is the argument from intentionality. Every mental act is directed toward an object. This is the Brentanian legacy Meinong accepts without reservation. But if we accept this principle, we must accept its consequences. When I think of a centaur, my thought is a real mental act. If we deny there is an object it is directed toward, we are saying there is an act without an object, which contradicts the very definition of intentionality. The only way out is to admit that the centaur, in some way, is an object. It does not exist, but it is. Descriptive psychology cannot afford to mutilate its own field of study by declaring certain mental acts illegitimate merely because their objects do not fit into a restrictive ontology. The second argument is semantic. We constantly speak about things that do not exist, and we understand each other. We say, the centaur is a mythological being, Pegasus has wings, the round square is contradictory. These sentences are meaningful. If we apply an elementary semantic principle, to every meaningful term there corresponds some kind of object, then we must admit there are objects for those terms. Not existent objects, but objects nonetheless. The theory of objects provides the framework for accounting for this meaningfulness without having to pretend that when we speak of centaurs we are not really speaking about anything at all. The third argument appeals to mathematics and ethics. Numbers do not exist in space and time. The number 3 is nowhere. Yet mathematics studies them, establishes their properties, relates them to one another. They are subsistent objects. Likewise, moral values, justice, goodness, are not real things, but ethics studies them and we direct emotional and volitional acts toward them. If psychology is to account for all mental acts, it must include acts directed at these objects. Denying them would mean leaving mathematical thought and moral experience outside psychology, which is untenable. The implications of the theory of objects are profound, affecting psychology, ontology, and the history of the Brentanian school. The first implication is the expansion of psychology's field of study. If Brentano's descriptive psychology dealt with mental acts and their objects, Meinong's enormously broadens the domain of those objects. No longer is it only about perceptions, memories, and judgments concerning real things. Mathematical thought, aesthetic experience, moral deliberation, fantasy, and the imagination of the impossible are also legitimate psychical phenomena. Psychology cannot afford to declare certain acts illegitimate merely because their objects do not fit into a restrictive ontology. The second implication is the foundation of a new discipline. The theory of objects is not a chapter of psychology or of metaphysics. It is an autonomous science, logically prior to both. Before asking what exists, we must establish the complete domain of the thinkable. For only by knowing everything that can be thought can we then determine which part of it actually exists. Gegenstands theory is, in this sense, the most fundamental science of all. The third implication is the influence on Gestalt psychology. The notion of objects of higher order, objects founded on other objects, as a melody is founded on its notes, is the theoretical foundation of the concept of Gestalt quality. Christian von Ehrenfels, Meinong's student, formulated in 1890 the idea that the perceptual whole is something more than the sum of its parts. That idea, which lies at the basis of the Gestalt school, derives directly from the Meinongian theory of founded objects. The fourth implication is the definitive break with Brentano. The master had evolved toward an increasingly strict realism, only individual substances exist. Meinong replies with a far more generous ontology. There are objects that are not substances, that do not exist in space and time, that are not even possible, and yet are legitimate objects of knowledge and of mental acts. The Brentanian school divides here irreversibly. The theory of objects is as suggestive as it is problematic. 4 questions have occupied its critics since its formulation. The first problem is that of impossible objects. Can the round square be a legitimate object of thought? Certainly we can say the words, round square, and construct arguments about it. But those words are contradictory. They describe nothing that could be, even in principle. If we admit impossible objects into our ontology, are we not admitting contradictions? Meinong replies that logic applies to the real and the possible, but not necessarily to the impossible. An impossible object can violate logic without the theory that studies it being contradictory. Yet this distinction between the logic of the object and the logic of the theory has been regarded by many as begging the question. The second problem is the distinction between the subsistent and the merely non-existent. Numbers subsist. They have properties, they relate to one another, they form a system. Centaurs do not subsist. They are fictions. Yet both types of object do not exist in space and time. What criterion distinguishes them? Meinong appeals to the notion of so-being. Numbers have a rich and determinate so-being. Centaurs do too, but of a different kind. The distinction is intuitive but not formalized. Without a clear criterion, the theory risks becoming arbitrary. The third problem is the status of the theory itself. Is the theory of objects an ontology that describes ultimate reality, or is it a semantics that describes how we speak about reality? If it is ontology, then impossible objects exist in some way, which is hard to accept. If it is semantics, then the theory does not speak of the world but of our language about the world, and its scope is far more modest. The ambiguity between these two readings has accompanied Meinong's reception from the very beginning. The fourth problem concerns the consequences for empirical psychology. If psychology must study acts directed at non-existent objects, how is that to be investigated experimentally? What experiment could be designed to study the act of thinking about a centaur as an act directed at a centaur? Meinong's theory offers a conceptual framework, but it is not clear that it can be translated into a program of empirical research. The reception of Meinong has oscillated between neglect, devastating critique, and rehabilitation. 3 milestones mark this debate. The first is the recovery of Meinong by John Findlay in 1933. Findlay, a British philosopher trained in the analytic tradition, published Meinong's theory of objects, the first systematic study in English of the Austrian thinker. Findlay connected the theory of objects with Brentano's descriptive psychology and defended its value for a general theory of mind. His reading is favorable but not uncritical. He already notes the difficulties of impossible objects and the ambiguity between ontology and semantics. For decades, Findlay's book was the main route of access to Meinong in the English-speaking world. The second milestone is Bertrand Russell's critique in his 1905 essay, On Denoting. Russell attacks the very heart of Meinongian ontology. How should we analyze a sentence such as, "The present king of France is bald"? France has no king. If we follow Meinong, we would have to postulate an object, the present king of France, that does not exist but is bald. Russell proposes an alternative. The sentence does not refer to an object at all. It is a disguised conjunction of claims. It asserts that there is at least one king of France, that there is at most one, and that that individual is bald. Since the first claim is false, the whole sentence is false. We need no non-existent objects. A logical analysis of language suffices. The principle of ontological parsimony, do not multiply objects beyond necessity, becomes a devastating argument against Meinong. The third milestone is the logical rehabilitation of Meinong by Richard Routley in 1980. Routley, an Australian logician, argued that a rigorous semantics can handle non-existent objects without falling into contradiction. He developed a Meinongian logic that formalizes the principle of the independence of so-being from being and allows reasoning about impossible objects without the system collapsing. For Routley, Meinong was not a naive metaphysician populating the world with extravagant entities, but a forerunner of free logic and intentional semantics. His rehabilitation has returned Meinong to the center of contemporary debates on reference, intentionality, and ontology. We have reached the end of our study of Alexius Meinong. 3 points to take away. First, the expansion of intentionality. Meinong takes the Brentanian principle to its ultimate consequences. If every mental act is directed toward an object, then we must accept objects that do not exist, that cannot even possibly exist. Psychology cannot limit itself to studying acts directed at the real. Mathematical thought, fantasy, the imagination of the impossible, moral deliberation are also legitimate psychical phenomena that deserve to be described and understood. Second, the principle of independence. The so-being of an object, its properties, what it is, does not depend on the object's existing. This seemingly simple idea founds a new discipline, the theory of objects, a science prior to both metaphysics and psychology, whose domain is everything thinkable. Third, a disputed but enduring legacy. Bertrand Russell's critique of 1905 seemed to demolish Meinongian ontology. But Richard Routley's logical rehabilitation of 1980 returned Meinong to the center of contemporary debate on reference, intentionality, and semantics. Moreover, his influence on Gestalt psychology, through Ehrenfels, connects his thought with one of the great schools of 20th-century scientific psychology. For those wishing to pursue Meinong further, the essential starting points begin with his own works. On Objects of Higher Order of 1899 introduces the notion of founded objects, the basis of Gestalt psychology. On Assumptions of 1902 expands the Brentanian classification of psychical acts. On the Theory of Objects of 1904 is the most systematic exposition of his thought. As for scholarship, John Findlay's 1933 monograph remains a classic reference for understanding the theory of objects in relation to Brentano's descriptive psychology. Richard Routley, in exploring Meinong's Jungle and Beyond in 1980, offers the logical rehabilitation that returned Meinong to the center of contemporary debate. For an up-to-date introduction, Johann Merich's article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy provides an excellent overview. In the next lesson we shall begin our study of Carl Stumpf, another of Brentano's students who brought act psychology into the laboratory. We shall focus on his psychology of sound, the founding of the Berlin Laboratory of Experimental Psychology, and his role as a bridge between Brentano's descriptive psychology and 20th-century experimental psychology. We hope you join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.